My name is Monk Rowe, and we're filming today for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive in Chautauqua, New York. And it's a pleasure to have Keith Ingham here, pianist and arranger, composer, recording artist, and English transplant, I guess we can say, to the United States.
Yeah, sure.
You have been, I should fill in our potential audience a little bit that we're at a jazz festival, and you've kind of been working double time because of one of the piano players couldn't get here.
Yeah, Dave Frischberg.
Yeah, we hope he's all
sick.
right.
Sure.
Yeah, but I enjoyed your music today, and
Thank you.
especially stepping in that last ensemble. It sounded like you belonged there.
Yeah, well, that was just a run-through. We had no rehearsal.
Yeah.
Just had to, you know, by the seat of your pants, we did it. That was good.
How often do you get to have a rehearsal in a jazz situation, I guess?
Well, usually not for this kind of thing. I mean, but, you know, those were complicated arrangements, so you have to try and get them down as best you can, 90% of it, you know, at first shot, without having played them before. But
right.
Yeah.
What brought you into jazz in England? Were you enthralled with it from the beginning, or?
I always loved the piano, and but my parents had a piano in the house, but it was kind of beat up thanks to the Luftwaffe, or a flying bomb. One of those V2s that destroyed pretty much the street opposite, and blew in the windows of my parents' house. I mean, this is during the wartime, and because I was born in '42, so I mean I don't remember anything about it. But luckily we weren't there at the time. But the piano, I always remember, was full of glass. You know, broken glass, you know, and it sounded that way. But I used to go to it and play when I was about 8 years old. And, you know, I always really liked it, but my parents weren't too keen on me playing music as a kind of a career. You know, when you really get started, you know, jazz at the time, what I got interested in was like the Beatles or the Stones were for a later generation. It was the kind of the thing that parents didn't approve of. You know, and I'll never forget once I brought home a 78, and it was an old spiritual, and the title was DJC Blues, and in brackets it gave the full title, which was Does Jesus Care? It was an old spiritual song, and they were playing. My father took one look at this, and he thought, wow, this is sacrilegious, you know. You can't have this kind of thing. So I had kind of, you know, it was tough. I used to play the piano when they were out and things like that, and listen to my records kind of, you know, quietly when I could. They didn't stop me buying records, but they didn't approve it. You know.
Was it partly the fact that jazz came from America, or was it just the music itself? No,
just the music. You know, it was like they thought it was jazz. Oh well, that's kind of the music of, you know. It was the young people. It was, you know, something that they didn't understand, and it had nothing to do with America. I mean, they didn't even know where it came from, probably. You know, but. And yet, my mother always liked the popular songs of the day, but popular music then was pretty sort of a bland affair. You had people like, I remember, like Guy Mitchell and Joe Stafford, you know, these sort of people. There wasn't anything gutsy or anything to offend the ears, you know, Perry Como. You know, it was good, professionally made stuff, but, you know, when the Beatles came along, that was a breath of fresh air, of course, in popular music. But...
did these songwriters, American songwriters of the 30s and 40s, did their songs make it over to England?
Yeah, quite a few of them did. I mean, a lot of them made it further. You know, they went on the continent. I mean, there's, you know, in France you get songs like, you know, Ces Petites Choses, which is These Foolish Things. You know, I mean, they sang them, you know, with French lyrics. Quite a lot of songs, you know, found their way over there and was sung very well sometimes by Jean Sablon people, and in England too. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean. Very often the British bands would do what we call it a cover version of an American hit, you know, and things like that. Yeah, sure. Oh yeah, and then of course during the war, when there was a lot of Americans over in England, as you know, service people and that. I mean, they brought their music with them, and you know, of course you had the wonderful Glenn Miller Army Air Force band came over, you know. Yeah.
So was your jazz learning mostly from records? Mostly
from records, because, you know, we didn't get American musicians coming to England at a time when I was growing up, because there was a musicians union ban, I think, on both sides. Certainly the English Musicians Union didn't want American artists coming in, like jazz musicians, because they said it would take work away from the local musicians. Well, in a sense, that's probably true, but also, you know, we couldn't get to hear these wonderful people who were still playing, and I bitterly regretted it, because they were over in Paris. You know, quite a lot of them came to Paris. I was too young to get over there on my own. And I never forgot the first time Stan Kenton's orchestra, which was very popular in England, you know, and we had our own wonderful band, like Ted Heath, for example, you know, I mean, it was a wonderful big band, and Ted's band kind of, you know, was a marvelous example of big band music. But Kenton, you know, was one of their inspirations. Here comes Stan Kenton. He didn't go to England. He went to the Isle of Man and played in a casino there, you know, and so many people, boatloads of people went over to hear him. I think it was, I forget the year, it could have been 53, 54, I don't know, around about then. And, you know, I was about 12 or something, you know, I mean, I wasn't into Kendon, but I thought it was marvelous that finally somebody's getting closer to the shores, you know. Then I think gradually we began to get people coming over. It was like I guess we had a reciprocal thing going on with the musicians. There was a kind of an English, they had this word trad, which I always hated, meaning traditional jazz, and these bands used to play what they thought was, it wasn't, you couldn't call it kind of American music, it was very much a European hybrid, with a very loud banjo plunking away, fast and furious tempos that didn't swing, they were just kind of muscle-bound in their intensity, you know, and these guys all playing like crazy. But it was, we had a band there, Kenny Ball, which was a little more musical than most of them, and they had a big hit with Midnight in Moscow, and they came over to the States, and then we began to get American musicians coming over in exchange. And of course, when the Beatles and the Rolling Stones took off, I mean, I think those English pop groups were coming over to America later in the 60s, then we got American jazz musicians back in exchange. It was a one-on-one basis, you know, which was good.
I remember, you know, Derek Smith?
Yeah.
Derek talked about, he came here during that ban, I think, and they wouldn't let him join the union.
All right.
And then they finally settled whatever their squabbles were. And
it's funny you mentioned Derek, because I remember listening. There was a program on the BBC, which was a wonderful program. We had some marvelous musicians. I don't, you know, I'm not talking about these trad people, but musicians like Kenny Baker and Bruce Turner and George Chisholm and people like that. And Kenny Baker's a wonderful trumpet player. And there was a program on the BBC called Kenny Baker's Dozen. And this was in the days of live radio, you know, none of this taping and stuff. You know, it was really live. And these guys were in the studio, and Derek used to play piano with them sometimes. It used to be either Norman Stenfeld, and I'd be listening to the piano player, lying in bed, you know, I suppose I'd done my homework, and I'm there going to school the next morning. Kenny Baker's Dozen had come on once a week, some night, you know, around about 11 o'clock. And it was marvelous. Introduced by a wonderful broadcaster called Wilfred Thomas, who was an Australian. He had a kind of a nice broadcasting voice, you know, and it wasn't that usual English, plummy kind of, you know, teeth in the back of your throat voice, you know. He was really good. And that's where I heard Derek, and, you know, and then he came over here. And a lot, of course, you know, British pianists have come over to America. I mean, Mary McPartland was probably the first, because she married the trumpet player Jimmy McPartland, who was a GI, and I guess Marion, you could call her a war bride or something. And then, of course, the wonderful George Shearing came over in 48, I think it was, or maybe, no, 46, and then maybe, I think he went back, and then he came back again, and I think George had the biggest commercial success, I mean, without the quintet and everything.
so did you find friends of a like nature who were getting into this music?
Oh, absolutely. You know, at school, you know, we collected 78s at the time. And it was really like a little protest, you know, you're having with the Woody Herman records and, you know, and Tommy Dorsey, Benny Goodman, you know, all these things of Charlie Christian and stuff, you know, and it was our kind of form of little bit of, you know, you knew the parents didn't like it. So
It was almost just like rock and roll.
exactly,
over here, right?
that's what I'm saying. It was the young people's thing, you know, and I think the same thing was in America too, you know, kids jiving and stuff like that in 1938, except it was, you had the thing here at Source, you know, we had to do it, had to make to do with records, you know, make do with that. But that was wonderful. And 78s, luckily I lived in, at the time in a little part of London, the south, in Streatham, which had a wonderful jazz record store there. They called it the Swing Shop. And the guy that ran it, Dave Carey, was a discographer. He was a good musician too, and he had a band. But that shop was a bus ride away from my school. And I used to go there after school and spend my pocket money. And Dave, you know, he'd play me these records because he knew I was crazy about this music. And so I got to learn an awful lot of listening to people that I wouldn't have heard of. Because, you know, if you follow the jazz critics, a lot of these critics in England, they had their own favorites, and at the time, you know, it was okay. You had Count Basie, Billie Holiday, a wonderful Duke Ellington, everything like this. But there was also an area of music that they completely forgot, and that was the kind of the white jazz of the 20s. You know, well, Dave liked that particularly. You know, the wonderful players like Eddie Lang and Bix Beiderbecke, the Dorseys, Miff Mole, And I got to hear them on records. I thought, my God, they're fabulous too. You know, these guys who are wonderful instrumentalists, but they were also, in the 20s, they were working like crazy. They were running from one recording date to another, running from one radio show to another, because radio was so big then in the 1920s, you know. And that's where I got to hear that kind of side to it too, you know, and I loved that as well. But I remember when the LP came in, that was marvelous because, you know, I know you had to really save your pennies to buy an LP. And then, do you remember the little EPs that came in?
Yeah.
Well, they were easy because you could get them in the house without your parents seeing. You know, those little things, you could stick them in your school case or something, you know, and they wouldn't see them coming in. And, of course, they didn't break like 78s, you know. So that was a boon.
So would you have to stick your ear next to your record player?
I played the records when my parents were out, you know. But I remember the first LPs I had. They had these wonderful little 10-inch LPs, which marvelous. Billie Holiday and Teddy Wilson I bought, and I just fell in love with that straight away because they had not only the great jazz musicians on them, but they had the songs. And I started getting really into these songs then because, you know, you had these songs done in a jazz way by composers like Jerome Kern, you know, and Irving Berlin and Rodgers and Hart and, you know, all the great songwriters, you know, and
So how did you get from that step to the actual playing of them? Through sheet music or through
listening to records, mostly through listening to records, you know. I used to try and play along with these Billy records and figure out what the tunes were, you know. I always had a good ear for tunes and then try and find the chords around it, you know.
Yeah.
And it's really, you know, today's world is very different because Duke Ellington was so prophetic when he said there'll come a day when most jazz players will have to come out of a conservatory, you know, and it's all this training they're getting now. You know, they're going to these jazz classes in these music colleges and so on. And he was right. These guys can play. I mean, they have wonderfully schooled techniques. But to me, there isn't an original thing amongst it. I mean, it all comes out homogenized, like cars, you know, or cans of soup. You know, everybody can play these modal things are into this. Sadly, I think a lot of these colleges, they think that jazz began with Charlie Parker or Coltrane even, you know, and it damn well doesn't. You know, it goes back to innovators far beyond them, who, in my opinion, were a lot more talented. People like Benny Carter, Duke Ellington, you know, Art Tatum, I mean, Fats Waller, you know, Fletcher Henderson, I mean, Bix Beiderbecke. You know, the list, you should start way back, you know. You
your
don't begin with...
today, your bandmates today have said the same thing.
Yeah, I know.
Almost verbatim, and they feel that most of the instructors that are teaching now grew up on Parker and Coltrane, I suppose, so that's where they feel the...
Well, it also has a political thing, and it has a racial bias too, to be honest. Let's face it, you know, they think jazz is black primarily. Well, I'm not going to argue that I think the greatest practitioners have been black musicians, no doubt, a question about it. But before that, you know, there were also people playing together, you know, and, you know, whites and that. I mean, sadly, the whites had a monopoly on the radio and the recordings and that kind of stuff. There certainly was you know, a racial barrier there, but blacks were recording, you know, very much so. Look at all those blues records that were produced, you know, in the 20s. I mean, so they weren't denied their opportunities. But what I'm saying is that a lot of great black musicians from the 30s, for example, like Henry Red Allen, J.C. Higginbottom, Coleman Hawkins even, I mean, they've been swept, not say swept under the carpet, but they've pretty much been forgotten. People like Frankie Newton, Pete Brown, great innovative players, Tube Berry, Roy Eldridge, Buck Clayton, you know, wonderful trumpet players. I mean, play rings around Wynton Marsalis, you know, completely swept under the carpet, you know. I mean, they've become forgotten people simply because these instructors think that bebop is the beginning, the fountainhead of it all, you know. So unless you were part of that bop thing, you know, you were small potatoes.
You were a moldy fig?
Well, I don't know, not that, but I mean, a musician like Benny Carter, who wonderfully is still alive, there is a consummate genius. I mean, not only was he a multi-instrumentalist, you know, great arranger. I remember reading the fact that the BBC, in their wisdom back in 1935, they hired Benny Carter to come over, and they just formed a kind of BBC dance orchestra. And Benny Carter was asked to come over there and arrange for it. And I talked to some of the old-time guys who are still alive who played in that band. They said Benny could play every instrument better than anybody in the band, except maybe the piano or something, you know. I mean, but you know, he was a terrific trumpet player. He could play all the reeds, you know. And I think he played a little guitar. I mean, extraordinary talent, you know. No, I mean, everything starts, I'm not detracting from Charlie Parker's genius or anything, but, you know, there was a musician of Carter's stature to me is far more, you know, transcends Charlie Parker, great as he was, you know, but this was all going on 10, you know, 15 years ahead of Charlie Parker. And Parker comes out of that, you know. Parker is not, you know, he grew out of, you know, the Jay McShann and those, he heard all that stuff, you know.
Yeah.
He liked... I believe he was quoted as saying he loved Jimmy Dorsey's alto saxophone playing because it was so technically brilliant, you know, and Parker was a brilliant technician, you know, so, I mean, but you've just got to acknowledge the fact that there was life before bebop, you know.
Well, it's interesting, too, because those people before Parker, a lot of them, they reached a larger audience than Parker ever did. And it's funny that
I suppose
it's not acknowledged that bebop, as technically demanding and as wonderful as it was, did not have the audience that some of the jazz before.
I think it had a small audience. You know, well, I say small. I mean, it certainly took off in a way. I think when you look back at it, but it was the urban areas. I mean, you first of all, there were some big bands, of course, like Billy Eckstine's band and. Dizzy Gillespie took a big band out, you know, but they were playing charts, and sometimes people didn't hear that thing they could dance to quite so much. But the bebop, essentially, I think it was small group things, and it was musicians perhaps playing, I'll not say for themselves, but it was very innovative, of course. And then I think it was the urban centers like New York, maybe, and LA, certainly. You know, those two sort of extremes, and then I think I wouldn't say it had a big audience, but certainly there were people playing it all around Detroit, you know, in those urban areas where there were jazz clubs and where people heard this. And Charlie Parker would go to those clubs as a guest artist, you know. I think he probably did reach a big audience. I'm sure he did, you know, but I don't think that there wasn't that kind of commercial possibilities to pick up on it. And secondly, you know, most of the things, the songs, they didn't have lyrics to them. You know, how are you going to remember a line like Donna Lee? Well, it's Indiana, basically, the song, you know, but, you know, you can't sing, you know, it's not back home again in Indiana, you know, so, I mean, it's the same chord structure, but, or whatever. What's that thing? What is this thing called love? Is it Hot House? You know, no. So,
which one is easier to whistle?
Well, what is this thing called love? Exactly. That's a good point because, you know, it's something that was commercially possible, you know, people could whistle it, you know, the humblest guy. And it's a very interesting point you say that because one of the hardest songs probably written is Blues in the Night. I mean, there's a middle strain on it, you know, which is kind of complicated. Harold Arlen and Johnny Mercer. That was probably one of their biggest hits simply because that catchy opening phrase, my mama done told me, bo-doo-dee-doo-doo-dee. Everybody was whistling. You know, going around, here comes the paper boy, you know. You know, that's it, you know.
Can you imagine that would be a great feeling to be a songwriter? Hear people whistling your tune.
They're really my heroes, the songwriters, you know. I think, I really think that jazz will probably come and go. I mean, it's the music of its time, and now I can't see, I mean, it's silly to say now, but I mean, because of time, you know, but it's going to go in different directions, of course, and I guess people will still be playing and be inspired by it, but it's not the music of today. I mean, the music of today, I think, is Elton John and, you know, and the things that relate to people now, country and western. I think we're living in a less sophisticated age in terms of music because the lyrics are very simple. They tell a simple story, basically, you know, and that kind of stuff, you know, I mean, it's always been there. But when there are no songwriters today writing with the sophistication of Cole Porter.
Yeah, well, they certainly had a different take with romance.
Oh, absolutely. You know? Yeah, well, there was romance. I mean, a quote-unquote romance, you know, sex or whatever. I mean, it's not out in the open, but it was implied. But Cole Porter was wonderful. I mean, look at how risque his lyrics could be, you know. you know, down in the depths on the 90th floor, you know. Do you know that song?
No.
Well, it's about this, you know, this rich lady up in a penthouse, you know, in a high-rise in Manhattan, right? And she's singing about how lonely she is. And she says, even the janitor's wife has got a perfectly good sex life, but here am I, all alone in the 90th floor. I mean, Porter's stuff was very risque, you know, and yeah, so was Lawrence Hart, a lot of his lyrics. There are alternate lyrics to Bewitched, Bothered and Bewildered that are pretty raunchy, you know.
Oh, wow.
But I mean, everything now is to be, you know, let it all hang out and that stuff. But I like some element of sophistication in there. I think the things that are not said but implied are much more interesting than just, you know, using the same old four-letter words all the time. Right. They're pretty boring, like jazz, you know, four-letter word.
Yeah.
But I really think that the composers, the American composers, are the kind of classical equivalents of this country has produced, you know. I mean, I really think that that's the music that's going to last. And however they keep getting interpreted, you know, jazz styles will come and go, pop music styles will come and go, but, you know, when you've written a body of work like Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart, Harold Arlen, Burton Lane, Julie Stein, Frank Lesser, you know, marvelous songs, marvelous original melodies. How did they come up with them? Why were they so prolific at a particular time? I mean, because there was demand.
And why did they last so long?
Why they last long? Because they're good. I mean, they're good melodies. They express, maybe the lyrics can be a little silly, maybe some of them are dated, but sometimes they express eternal truths, you know, like a lyric like Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. You know, you're madly in love with somebody and they don't return your love, you know, when your heart's on fire, smoke gets in your eyes. Beautiful. You know, Otto Harbach wrote that to Kern's wonderful melody. I mean, that's going to still around, you know. And I notice when I'm playing places, you know, young people today, they still like that romance, you know, that thing about it. And but they'll only ask for things that they've heard, you know, on the radio. And this is where the power of the damn media is really not getting jazz, and particularly the jazz that has gone before what I call the golden age, to me, is the 30s and the 40s and the 20s, not bebop era. People call that a golden age now, you know. But I'm thinking about when these wonderful songs were currency, you know, when they were part of the language and part of the everyday life of Americans, particularly because they had it first, you know. The young people, they ask for things that they've heard. They ask for, you know, as time goes by, of course, because of the movie, someone to watch over me, you know. And then you play them, Smoke Gets in Their Eyes. Oh, yeah, that rings a bell. My parents had that record or something, you know, and they like it as soon as they hear it, you know. They like, you know, Gershwin, you know.
Yeah.
Of course, I forgot to mention Gershwin, my God, you know.
How can we expect them to get into something that they're not exposed to?
But gradually, I think people find things, you know. I mean, if you're that, you know, caught onto it, you'll hear it, you know.
Well, let me get
really
back to, that was wonderful to hear. I want to get back to, you started accompanying, visiting American jazz musicians?
Yeah, I got lucky. I was so lucky, in fact. One of my first jobs, when I went to university just to please my parents, kind of thing. Yeah, but I wanted to go, you know, it was 3 good years. I played with the university jazz band, I was going there. And when I left it, I was up at Oxford for 3 years, and I loved it. I mean, that was great. But then I thought, now I've got to do what I want to do. I've satisfied them. You know, they made sacrifices for me to go to university. Okay, that was nice. And I said, I'm going to try and do music. And of course they said, oh, well, it's a precarious profession. You know, you won't have a chance. You know, it's just going to be, you know, he'll forget about it and go and work in a bank later or do something, you know. Well, I've been working ever since, and I've kind of never been out of a job, you know. And funny enough, my father, within 2 years, had been made redundant from his steady, you know, insurance job. And here he was telling me, you're going to have a precarious kind of situation. And he was kind of scuffling around to try and find something at, you know, in his middle 50s. So it was kind of ironic. But anyway, when I left university, I started playing with local British bands. Wonderful clarinet player who's sadly now dead, Sandy Brown. And then the Americans started to come over, like I was talking about, you know, we're talking about 1964 or 5, you know, with the, you know, the start of the British rock thing and the coming over, reciprocal arrangements. The first guy, pretty much, that I worked with was Henry Red Allen, who was one of the great jazz trumpet players of all time. You know, he was, he'd grown up with the big bands here, Fletcher Henderson, and he'd arrived in New York, I guess in about 1927, somewhere around there. And this guy was larger than life. You're talking not only of a great instrumentalist and a very original player, but he was also a great showman and a great man for an audience. You know, he would stand there with this wonderful brocade jacket and stand there and talk about his life. He was from New Orleans. His father had had a brass band in New Orleans, and he grew up. He knew all the old greats. You know, he knew Jelly Roll Morton, played with Jelly Roll Morton, recorded with Jelly. He knew, you know, all the people from New Orleans. He knew Louis Armstrong, of course, Sidney Bechet, Albert Nicholas, all this great tradition. He was part of that heritage. And he'd get up there and he'd talk to them. You know, he'd say, my father, you know, Henry Allen Sr., he'd say, you know, he said, Louis Armstrong played for him in his band, and Sidney Bechet and that. And he says, I was there. He says, that was my dad, you know. And he'd create this spell, this magic, and then he'd start to play, you know. And you never heard such a chill, you know, go. And it was the same kind of, the French word, I think, is frisson, you know, that tremor that goes right through you. I got that when I first heard Louis Armstrong live, and it was the All-Stars. And the curtains in the theater are closed, and suddenly you hear this trumpet playing Louis' signature tune behind the curtain. Ba, dun, da, dun, doo, doo, da, da, dee. Sleepy Time Down South. And you suddenly realize, here is this guy, you know, coming out, and curtains parted, and there he is. But the magic of hearing that trumpet behind the curtains, before, the sound came before the guy, you know. You see Louis, of course, you know.
Wow.
Just incredible. Yeah, it's magical. And I think those kind of guys had that love of entertaining, you know, as well, which I think bebop somehow didn't have.
Yeah.
You know, they turned, I wouldn't say they were playing down to an audience, but it was not that kind of music. Of course it has warmth, bop has a lot of beauty in it and that, but it doesn't have that kind of charismatic thing that goes to an audience to entertain. And I think the great early jazz musicians, I mean, like Ellington, entertainer. Have you ever seen those shorts of Duke Ellington with the band?
Yeah.
He's playing the piano, he's looking at the camera, the hands are going like this, you know, it was a great show. You seen that drum kit Sonny Greer had up there? the tips and everything. Oh, the chimes, what a show. Wonderful. And can you imagine Fat Swallow, the piano player? You know, you've seen him in movies. I mean, as soon as he comes on, he steals the whole scene, you know, because you can't take your eyes off him, you know. He's magnetic people. And I think they had that thing, you know, that quality of having to, you have an audience, you've got to go and entertain this audience, you know, whether you're playing jazz or anything. And a lot of those guys didn't think of themselves as jazz players, but just musicians, you know. I think Bechet was like that.
That's what Louis Armstrong said. He said he was an entertainer.
Entertainer.
Yeah.
You know. I think in all humility, I mean, it's a really different thing. I mean, I think it's people who've come afterwards who've made them these jazz gods. I mean, but Louis, as you say, was an entertainer. He loved his public. Kept going, like Basie, kept going right till the end. You know, Duke, the same thing. I mean, they had to get that audience. You know?
Well, eventually you, like Shearing and Marion McPartland, you decided that
I was
here?
Well, I was playing with these Americans. I keep digressing, but I was playing with these Americans. They said, you know, come over to the States. Actually, when Red Allen, when he came over there, he wanted to bring me back to America. Now, this was, what, 64, I think. Red died in 67. And I, to be honest, I mean, I knew a lot of tunes we read in that, and I thought, my God, I can't go there. I mean, it's like throwing into the deep end, you know. And he says, no, come on, I can go. I want you to come and be part of my quartet at the Metropole. Sammy Price, the piano player, was leaving. And he says, you know these tunes? He says, you can play good, you know, you'll be fine, you know. So he actually tried. And the Musicians Union here wouldn't let it happen. You know, it wouldn't give me a permanent thing or anything. So I had to wait till 1980 before I came over, you know.
all that time.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I did come over to the States, you know. I was playing, the only way you could get over was play the piano on board a transatlantic liner, you know, and they had some of those left, and I got a job on that and came over there, and, you know, that was nice. That's how most of the British guys, musicians, could get over to America, get to New York and hear the music, you know. I remember Bruce Turner, a wonderful sax player who's dead now, he said he came to New York once. He said he got off the ship, went into this little joint on 52nd Street. He said it was Charlie Parker Quintet was on with Art Tatum playing, you know, intermission piano. And he says the place was empty. Can you imagine? You know, Charlie Parker and something, I think Kenny Dorham or somebody playing there, and Al Haig probably on piano, and Tatum playing intermission piano, and the joint was empty. I mean,
What a story.
yeah. I mean, it was just... But anyway, yeah, I did accompany a lot of American artists. I mean, Pee Wee Russell, Charlie Shavers, Benny Carter, so nice. I mean, because when you come here, it's a different story because this country's so vast. You know, you don't see these people anymore. You know, you see, you know, I mean, wherever. But when they came to England, you know. But anyway, Red Allen was so encouraging, and then. But I got here in 1980, and started working in New York. Of course, there was still a few clubs going there and that, and start gigging around and working in places. But sad to say, I was lucky enough to play with some of the, the greats of the era that I particularly love, like Vic Dickinson and Doc Cheatham, both now gone. I mean, there's very few of those people left, and and hardly any of them play, which is so sad. But that's what happens,
Right.
It's just the way things have to be. But I'm very glad I came here because really America is still the source of this music, and you find wonderful things that you can still sense the continuity, of what you loved and what still goes on. For example, I was playing in a restaurant when I first got here, and up comes a note, could you play this song and that song, And I knew these songs, and they were Richard Rodgers tunes, And the guy that sent the note up was Richard Rodgers, Well, at the time, he'd lost his voice. He couldn't speak. He had this problem with the throat cancer or something, so we had to write everything down, And on the way out, he wrote a note saying, thanks so much for playing my tunes. And of course, being British, I think, had I known he was there, I wouldn't have played a Rodgers song. He's probably sick of hearing that. He's hearing his own tunes. Forget about it. You want to hear his own tunes. And they were all like that. And I worked a lot with a wonderful jazz singer, Maxine Sullivan. And I did 3 albums with Maxine. And they were albums devoted to songwriters who are still alive. Burton Lane, we did. Harold Arlen, we did some songs of the Cotton Club, and Harold was still alive. And Julie Stein. And I was so lucky to get to meet these guys. I didn't meet Arlen, but I met Julie Stein, I met Burton Lane, and to actually meet the songwriters and go to their apartment. And I remember going up to Julie Stein's apartment, and he gave us a song that he'd one of the last songs he'd written. He said we could use it on the album. Of course, sure, we'd love to. We could do it. Yeah, we did it. And up in his apartment, there were paintings by George Gershwin on the wall. Gershwin was a very accomplished artist.
Wow.
And he had one of Gershwin's paintings. I remember sitting there and the phone rings, and who's on the other end of the line is Irving Berlin, So, I mean, you're in there, and there's all this thing going on. Irving Berlin, a living legend, talking to Julie Stein, who's a legend,
The Gershwin painting.
And the Gershwin painting on the wall. That's not bad. You think New York is a pretty good place to be. I love New York anyway. And then I meet Burton Lane, who was, they're great theater composers. This whole tradition of the American musical coming out of theater and then going into movies, and then the songs are taken up by bands. It's just a wonderful continuity. And it still lives on in a lesser way. I mean, I was playing I have a steady gig in New York. I'm lucky to say that because there's so few of them, but playing in this nice little restaurant. And this lady comes in and she said, do you know a song called You Go to My Head? It's a beautiful tune. So I said, sure. So I played it. She says, my Uncle Fred wrote that, on the way out. I said, yeah. She said, there's a guy called J. Fred Coots who wrote You Go to My Head, of course, and For All We Know, that beautiful old song. And he also wrote Santa Claus is Coming to Town, which is his big money spinner, So she said, yeah. I said, Uncle Fred. I remember Uncle Fred. He said, every time December came round, he said, oh, we're going to eat good for the next year because you get all the royalties on Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Yeah, right. So
thanks, ASCAP, sending those checks.
ASCAP sending those checks in, yeah. And I remember talking to Burton Lane about that. Well, talking to his wife, actually. And when she married Burton Lane, and she couldn't figure out how somebody could earn all this money by not going out to work during the day, because all the royalty checks had come in for his songs, like How About You and How Are Things in Glockamore, all these things from Finian's Rainbow, Old Devil Moon,
Right.
Oh, wonderful songs,
Great.
Yeah.
When did you first able to use your arranging skills?
Well, I'd done some things, mostly with doing things for singers, Maxine Sullivan, and just arranging stuff behind her.
Yeah.
Because with singers, it's nice to have a little organized backing, like you heard tonight. We did those things,
Yeah.
behind Rebecca. It's lovely. It makes all the difference because it gives it a nice little showcase setting for a singer. I do like singers. A lot of musicians don't like singers, but I like it because you're hearing the lyrics. And it's good to work with. I mean, I think there's a very healthy cabaret scene. That's one thing. I mean, the jazz scene to me is not particularly, I'll say, interesting. It's not. It doesn't interest me much today. I mean, what's going on in contemporary ways, which may sound a bit fuddy-duddy to you, but I don't believe that anything that's 30, 40 years old is particularly old. Perhaps the Europeans, we have a different time concept, but, to me, Jerome Kern and these melodies are as fresh and as fresh as paint as when they were first written, and you can still play them with absolute joy. But there is, I think, a cabaret scene, particularly in New York, where there are a lot of these young people who love this music. They either love the theater aspect of it, or they like the, you know, the cabaret singers. And they're coming up, they're digging into this great archive of American music, you know. And there's so much stuff out there. I mean, it's wonderful. I just recently saw on TV, they did a tribute to Ira Gershwin, you know, the lyricist. And somebody had found a song he wrote with Harry Warren. There's No Music for Me, or there'll be, I think the title was There's No Music for Me. Never heard that song. It was unpublished, and it's a beauty. It's an absolute gem. And there's a show in London where they revived it, you know, and it's kind of, that's contemporary, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it doesn't get the attention that Andrew Lloyd Webber's blown up nonsense gets, you know, because that's the blockbuster stuff, right? That's Broadway now. But it's there, you know. There's a show, funny enough, ironically, what's the most successful show in London right now? It's a show about Al Jolson.
Oh.
Yeah, Jolson, of all things, you know. I think hopefully people will get sick of these elephantine productions of, you know, tuneless tunes and, oh, God, I mean, the stuff now like Jekyll and Hyde and stuff you have there, I mean, it's just, I can't describe it. It's kind of melody in a way, but you can't really say that this is a song. This isn't a tune. It doesn't have a beginning or end. It just sort of rambles on and rambles in the same basic kind of harmonies that can be understood in Saigon, Uzbekistan, you know, simple-minded kind of melodies, you know, that are picked up anywhere in the world.
Yeah,
you know,
unfortunately, it seems like the composers have delved into the harmonic schemes of pop and rock and roll.
That's right.
Which are certainly not too rich compared to, you know.
They're not rich at all. I mean, it's, somebody said to me, I often wondered, I said, where did the change set in? He says, when the amateurs took over the music business, the business side of it. And I think that's probably true. It probably came in with rock, whatever you want to say, but it was suddenly, you know, the people who began to control the tastes of, you know, what's going to make a record and that were not necessarily professional musicians. Whereas once upon a time, the guys that worked in these music publishing houses in the, you know, like, for example, in New York, I mean, they had on their staffs very, very schooled musicians, you know, who would sort of look at a song and say, well, is this worthy of our house publishing it?
Like a book. Like a book publisher.
Exactly. I mean, the famous one was, I think it was what was the publishers of the Cole Porter things? Anyway, famous, I think, at one of those companies. They had a guy called Max Dreyfus who was famous. I mean, he was an accomplished pianist, brilliant musician. I mean, he could spot a well-constructed song. He was Jerome Kern's amanuensis, you know, and that. I mean, he was responsible. I mean, he brought Gershwin in there. I mean, all these people, they really knew quality, you know. But like you say, like book publishing, you had an editor who could actually read, you know. I mean, somebody who was literate, you know. That's very true. That's a very good analogy.
Yeah.
And that's all gone now, you know. I mean, what makes a hit now? I don't know. I mean, it's just anything.
I have a very small theory that technology plays in a role in this, and that the more toys a person has to play with, the less quality you're going to come up with.
Oh, that's very true.
Most of the time.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it's certainly true, as you talked about technology, it's certainly true of the CD as compared to the old analog vinyl. I mean, it's so interesting now that there are a lot of companies making vinyl again in a big way because it sounds better. I mean, most musicians will tell you that it sounds better. You know, the old LPs sound better than the CDs. There's a reason for it, you know. I mean, the analog recording had I think, a more natural sound. And, you know, I mean, CD sounds like, it's all very, very good and it sounds very, but to me there isn't a heart in it. There's something missing. Perhaps the stuff that's recorded for CD is it's obviously very fine, but when I think about what they did when they transferred the analog stuff into digital and then put it on CD, it doesn't sound as good as the LPs. And now they're going back to vinyl. There are companies in America making vinyl. You know, I don't know how is it, 200 milligrams. I don't know what it is. These things weigh. You know, I just bought one the other day. It cost me $26. I got Duke Ellington's Anatomy for a Murder, the soundtrack. It's on vinyl again. You know, I never had that record first time around. I bought this thing. It weighs a ton. Put it on. It's wonderful.
Wow.
Yeah, you know, on a turntable. You know. Oh God, yeah. It's so different. You could really have a sense of, you know, almost like you're in the studio. Yeah. Anyway, that's by the way. You're talking about technology. Classical recordings. Those wonderful recordings Mercury did, you know, of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra back in the 50s, they had one microphone in the hall, and that was it, on a whole orchestra, whole symphony orchestra. One mic. They sound fabulous because the orchestra balanced
It
itself.
was up to the musicians and the
Yeah,
conductor to do
to
it.
do it, exactly. And nowadays, you go into a studio, if you ever seen, you know, one of these groups things going on, man, they've got about 20 microphones on a kit of drums. You know, I don't know why. You know, and then when they record these guys, you know, they get these microphones, you know, and you've got a cello player, you know, you can hear everything that his fingers are squeaking on the soundboard. You know, you hear the guitar, you hear the fret, you know, everything is going like this. I mean, it's nutty.
Well,
you know.
well, you've done a lot of research, I can tell, because you've recorded albums about Victor Young's songs.
Right.
And
Yeah, it's
you know,
another great writer.
Fred Astaire.
Well,
Was that the music that Fred Astaire was
singing.
associated with? and
Yeah,
singing?
I mean, he was associated. You know, everybody, the composers seem to love Fred Astaire for some reason. I mean, he might not be a singing, you know, he's not a singer's voice per se. He's not like Crosby, Sinatra,
Yeah.
you know, Perry Como, who is got a very good voice and everything like that. But Tony Bennett up to a point. But I mean, Fred Astaire had a way. I think because he had such a great rhythmic sense, being a dancer, his delivery was very light. You know, and he sang those Berlin songs, you know, like, you know, putting all my eggs in one basket, da do do da do do dee dee. He had a jazz feel in his singing as well as in his dancing, and you know, it's beautiful. I mean, it's so right, you know, elegant, and he had to me he had a jazz feeling. He wasn't a jazz singer, you know, like, I mean, what is a jazz singer, quote unquote, now? Who
Right.
knows?
Right.
You know, certainly not scatting and stuff. I mean, but he just had a lovely lightness of touch, and they all seemed to love him. I mean, the way he sang their songs. You know? Yeah. So yeah, we did an album of his tunes. I mean, they're wonderful tunes. I mean, look at those. You know, the Gershwin wrote that. You know, was it Shall We Dance? And then there's the thing, Irving Berlin. I forget the names of the damn movies now with Ginger Rogers, but you know, it was incredible in the 30s. You know.
I see we're in on a Condon memorial thing too, Eddie Condon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was with Bobby Gordon. No, we just did a little, yeah. It wasn't a tribute or anything. I mean, Eddie Condon is a kind of a catalyst for music that's now just completely out of, you know, any of these jazz critics or these educators would not mention Eddie Condon. I mean, they think he's absolutely beneath them. You know, it's a guy who was, he was a wonderful rhythm guitar player, but he didn't play any solos. What did he do? He drank himself crazy. You know, he was just part of the times, but he was a wonderful catalyst. He brought together so many great players. I mean, I don't know why, you know, that kind of music was much maligned. Of course, once upon a time, it was a particular kind of a New York kind of music, I thought, you know, Eddie's music. When he was playing that, he had his own club, as you know, down in Greenwich Village. In 1946, he opened up, I think, and it was a really kind of it attracted a kind of a literate crowd, maybe Ivy League kind of crowd down there. You know, they were editors, publishers, journalists, you know, kind of somewhat racy and somewhat well-educated, you know, Harvard people and that, you know, businessmen and that, but they liked it. They liked the sound. A lot of them, you know, like John O'Hara, the novelist, was a, you know, and the novelist wrote Cannery Row. Steinbeck, yeah, you know, they were all people who went there. I mean, Condon's was a great place. Of course, then, of course, at the time, bebop was there, and that was the other side of the fence. You know, he was the total extremes. And even the big bands, too, you know, were another extreme, because the Condon guys thought that if you worked in a big band, you were somewhat selling out. You know, you were sacrificing the jazz for commercial security, you know what I mean? But of course, it was so much work there in New York, particularly, you know, back in the 46. I mean, there were so many places going and so many, there were jobs, you know, so now there's nothing like that at all. I mean, it's absolutely all gone. Well, the times have gone. You know?
Yeah.
But, you know, you didn't have to feel that if you couldn't work there, you couldn't work somewhere else, or this was the only place to be, you know. And I wish I'd been around in those times, I'll tell you. You know,
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, because it was, also the music had a sense of fun to it, you know. And I like those clubs where, you know, people were drinking and talking and romancing and flirting and, you know, or quarreling and fighting, and the music's going on and everything it's all part of life. And I think that's why the jazz sounded that way. It had so much color and flair and fervor and if you like, drunken whatever, you know. I love those places, those sleazy bars, you know, that's wonderful. You get just a piano player. People tell me, you know, Willie LaLion Smith would be playing in a joint, you know, it'd be just a few drunks and, as somebody says, a couple of ladies at the bar who, you know, use more lipstick than deodorant, you know. And Well, he'd be playing there, and apparently just to keep atmosphere in the joint, he'd just be vamping, you know, boom, ding, ding, da, 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 and just looking around, da, 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 da. You know, there's hardly anybody in there, but he'd be playing that, you know, just to get something going, and then people would fall in. I had a little, I think I just got in the tail end of that when I worked in Jimmy Ryan's at New York, and that was that sort of place, you know, where you could smell the toilet from the entrance, and, you know, you're up on the bandstand. It was really, and they watered down the drinks and everything, you know. But it was part of the old thing, and it was just, I worked there with Max Kaminsky, one of my favorite trumpet players, and Roy Eldridge, you know, was there during the week, and Max did the weekends, and it was just pretty much the end of that in the early, when I got here, 80, 81, 82, you know, and then the thing, that whole street, it had another version of Condon's club next to Ryan's on 54th Street, and then I think the Prudential Insurance Company decided to, they bought the whole block and demolished it to make a car park, so that went, you know. So corporate America struck again. You know. Well,
you know, I'm glad that there seems to be at least a small and loyal market for the kind of music that you're fond of.
Well, there is. Yeah, there is. It's small, and I guess it seems to get smaller. You know, if you look at the audience today, most of these people, God bless them, are, you know, not in the first bloom of youth. You know.
Yeah.
And if only we could reach younger people. I mean, you know, the players, you know, are pretty young. Some of them. I mean, we're not teenagers, but you know, we still think we've got something to offer.
Sure.
And based on, we sort of work within a tradition and try to do your own thing with it, you know, which I don't see anything wrong in that. And instead of trying to be, you know, as modern, I say modern is such a silly word, because what's modern today gets very dated. And I think if you look back to the things that were considered very innovative at the time, like a lot of that Stan Kenton stuff is dated terribly, because, you know, and that kind of beboppy scat singing where the guys go, you know, it sounds so corny. It looks like those old, silly old suits, those zoot suits and things, you know, that nobody would wear. But the really good stuff stays, you know, and I don't think you should aim to be timeless, but just if you're doing it true to yourself and not going for, you know, for these sort of effects and, you know, trying to be hip all the time, you know, it's something will come through. But, but I do wish, I mean, that's where the media could help in a way. But would you ever see a band like ours on David Letterman?
Right.
No way. Or would you ever see us on even an early morning show, you know? No, it's sadly no, because these people don't know. These guys that produce these programs don't know. They grew up with the Rolling Stones, or probably even things like Led Zeppelin, something that came afterwards, you know.
The Rolling Stones are old now.
I know they are, yeah. Isn't that sad?
You
know, geriatric rockers, you know. Exactly, they're older than we are, you know. Exactly, they're getting ready for another tour just to make another zillions, you know, millions. So. Charlie Watts, the drummer with them, I knew him in London. He used to come in and sit in with the band where we played in the Café des Artistes in the Fulham Road, and we always thought he was dreadful. But he did love jazz. Charlie's always loved jazz. I think he plays much, you know.
Yeah, he did a big band.
Oh, yeah, he's loved jazz. I mean, he also likes, not just the Charlie Parker thing. I know he loved Earl Hines and things. I mean, God knows how he must have felt a fish out of water with those other guys, you know, who jazz was absolutely. I don't think Jagger liked jazz at all. I think the only record he ever liked it was Ramsey Lewis's "The In Crowd." Do you remember that?
Sure do.
Da da do do do. Well, it got a great beat to it, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah,
the piano was out of tune too.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah, done in that Bohemia
it's got
Caverns.
that thing you were talking about.
Exactly, that's the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Exactly. Isn't that? You can imagine the bodies and all the sweat and they dance. Dun, 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 dun. It was great. I loved it too. Yeah, you're right.
Oh, God.
That's where I like, you know, the Horace Silver band, you know, I was lucky enough to hear Horace in London. I mean, that had a, you know, that kind of grease and funk to it, like they call it. I loved Horace Silver, you know what I mean? That came out of bebop, but it had that wonderful quality, you know, and Blakey too, you know, I mean.
Dirty funk.
Yeah, I loved it. I mean, I'm not knocking bebop by any means. I mean, I don't want to give that impression because I have so many records in my collection. I just love Horace Silver. His piano playing is so pure. You know, there's not a note that goes to waste. It's like, in a sense, like Duke, you know, Duke Ellington. It's just, you know, and Monk, too. I'm crazy about Thelonious Monk. I mean, there's an innovator. I mean, God almighty, you know, yet people are still trying to catch up with his stuff. It's like Tatum. I mean, there's so much to Tatum that it's just impossible to unravel. But when you listen to it, you know, these harmonic things that he was doing are so extraordinary. You know, I think Art Tatum must have had one of the most brilliant minds, you know, of any field. I mean, if he could have been in any other field, I mean, here's this blind black guy, you know, who had a mind like a mathematical wizard in a way. I mean, how he could find his way through this labyrinth of harmonic sophistication and find his way out of it, you know. It's really amazing.
Really?
Incredible. He seems to do, it's like, solving a crossword puzzle and scratching your head and doing everything at the same time. And it all seems to kind of resolve in something. And then, well, his critics say he overplayed and everything and showed off his technique. Okay, yeah, you have to take that with it, you know. It's rather like, in a parallel to classical music, it's like those kind of endless romantic pieces, you know, like Liszt. I mean, there's a zillion notes a minute because Liszt was that kind of piano player. He was a virtuoso, you know.
Yeah,
So he
I can
wrote
do
those
it,
kind of
so I'm going to write it.
Exactly, yeah. And if you know, very few people could play it, you know. I mean, apart from him and Joseph Hoffman and then Rachmaninoff, of course, you know, there's great tradition.
Well, you have to go back to work soon.
Yeah, I do.
But I wanted to follow up quickly on one little. You mentioned the thing about the Beatles in '64.
Yeah.
And they certainly changed our society, but
Yeah.
no one ever said anything about the fact that they opened up a market even for jazz musicians to go over.
Yes, they did. I mean, it's kind of, well, not only them, but all the groups that came afterwards, you know. I mean, Jerry and the Pacemakers, all these groups came over to America because they had hit records.
Yeah.
You know, and we started to get that, and then, you know, you could send the pop groups over and we would get American jazz artists in return. So, I mean, if you could send a group, you know, 4 or 5 guys, you could get, I mean, in effect, you know, I mean, at the time, there weren't American groups in a way that would go over there. You didn't have as many. But we had the Stones, you know, and Jerry and the Pacemakers. We had Fleetwood Mac. We had Pink Floyd. We had, what's that? Yeah, Fleetwood Mac are still around. I mean, there's the name. I mean, it's extraordinary. They've had a terrifically long shelf life. I think it's wonderful. But, you know, we used to get the musicians would come back, you know, so, you know, we'd say goodbye Mick Jagger, you know, hello Ben Webster. Thank God, you know, I'll settle for that. That's fair exchange and no robbery, you know, that's perfect.
That's
you know.
good.
Yeah, but that's how we used to do it, you know. Well, that's how they could work it out, the musicians' unions, you know, because they were all power. They had power then, they don't have any now.
No.
No, it's all gone. I mean, most of these people don't belong to the union anymore. I mean, these rock people and that, they don't belong.
Right.
You know.
It's not going to do anything.
No, it's not going to do anything. It's just...
It's not like they need the money.
No, I mean, I'm not knocking the musicians' union. I mean, it's good for, you know, for symphony orchestras, arranging contracts, salaries or whatever, but... You know, but basically it's pretty much...
I wanted to play one thing for you before you go.
Oh, thank you. Margie. That's Dan Barrett, yeah, that's me.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
This caught my ear because I hear... In the background, he's playing some nice bluesy, almost
oh yeah, I love
gospel-y
it.
things.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
I love it. I love those piano players. Yeah, I love that music. Gospel music, I'm crazy about it.
Yeah.
Oh, the music out of those churches, or the blues thing, yeah. Jay McShann. Yeah.
Nice lick.
Thank you.
Nice lick.
One of my favorite piano players, Ray Bryant, he used to do that stuff. I mean, his sister was a wonderful, I believe, gospel player, played in the church, you know, pianist. And you ever heard that piano player with Mahalia Jackson? Mildred Falls? Oh, it's wonderful. You ever seen that Mahalia Jackson, Jazz on a Summer's Day?
Oh, that, yes.
Yeah, when they do that, Didn't It Rain?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's rocking. I mean, that swings like bassy and everything. I mean, it's just incredible. And it's just, I think there's an organ and a piano, and I think that's about it, you know. And there's Mahalia singing. It's just incredible, isn't it? And she's got, maybe got a tambourine or something. Yeah, oh, it's glorious. Glorious.
Well, this has been a fascinating session.
Good.
I'm so glad you were able to join us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a little bit tired now, yeah. Got to go back.
Well, maybe playing will seem easy after this, because we've really been...
No, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'd just like to say a final thing. I also love, deep love of New Orleans jazz. You know, the old stuff that, you know, the Bunk Johnson things, the George Lewis things that has such heart. And those guys could pick a tempo, you know, this always right, you know, for how they played. You know, that's the secret, I think, of finding things. I mean, that's beautiful too. I really love the whole spectrum of it, but, you know, not too about now, but, you know, there is so much wonderful stuff that went there. You can always, it's so inspiring because you can draw on that forever, you know. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay,
are there any counterparts of American musicians who've gone over to England and learned as much about your music as you have about
Well, there's not much I could say. You know, what do you mean? British music, I mean, well, we never had anything as wonderful as jazz. You see, I think it comes from a melting pot society where you've got all these different strains coming together, you know. This is the whole point. You know, you had Italians here, so you have this wonderful lyric quality. You have, Afro-Americans, as they're called now, but you have that rhythmic thing maybe they brought, that looseness and that sense of swing. You had the Germans here, so you have the correctness of intonation and things like that. You have a whole melting pot, and they all brought their music. When you had the Russians with all that minor key soul stuff, it's wonderful. I mean, Gershwin is Russian, but also very Jewish, and that kind of sad, soulful feeling that's in his music is, I think, more Jewish than Russian, or American. I mean, it's just Porgy and Bess could almost be a Jewish opera rather than a black opera, some of that stuff. It's so, it's wonderful.
Wow.
But it's, it's the melting pot that America is. It made American music. That's what it is. I mean, there's nowhere else, nothing like it, is there? There's nothing like it in the world. You're so lucky. You're so lucky. And don't lose it, because it's your great contribution to world culture. I mean, it's your Beethoven, your Haydn, your Schubert, your Debussy, your Ravel, your Elgar, your Henry Purcell, or whatever you want to call it, your Rachmaninoffs, your Stravinskys, it's all there. It's Duke Ellington, it's Fats Waller, it's Henry Red Allen, it's Bix, it's Eddie Lang, it's Joe Venuti, it's up there. And God bless it,
Oh, God.
We're lucky to be...
We got to get you on Letterman.
Yeah, okay. Well, I wouldn't be able to get in a word in edgeways, because he has, Well, I tell you about the Letterman show, they won't let anybody of any intelligence on there because they feel somebody might upstage him, so. Which probably wouldn't be that hard.
Well, thanks. I feel like we should etch those words in the stone somewhere.
Okay.
Spread 'em.
Well, thank you both.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks
Monk.
for
It's been a
your time.
pleasure. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
See you.
Right.